Well, good morning, everybody. I hope you had a wonderful weekend worshiping the Lord, being with your family. Glad you've joined me today. In our devotion, we're looking at Romans chapter 6, and hopefully you've already read the chapter. Now, some of you may have Googled what are shucky beans, getting shucky in Kentucky. Old timers, so they could have green beans in the wintertime, would take green beans in the summer, and there's different variations of green beans, and they would dry them out. Maybe string them with a needle and thread and hang them on the side of the house for a few days in the summertime, or throw them on a blanket on a table out in the yard and let the sun dry them out, and then they would store them in a cool place or a dark place and bring them out in the wintertime and cook them like you would any other time. String them before you hang them out to dry them out. But that's shucky beans, and our tradition at Thanksgiving was to eat shucky beans. And so that's what shucky beans are. If you've never done it, try it. You don't know what you're missing. They're really, really good. All right, Romans chapter 6. If I could summarize this chapter, it's this. What Paul says here is, stop sinning and stop making excuses. Okay, that's my Steve Hogg paraphrase. Stop sinning and stop making excuses. One of the excuses that some made when Paul wrote this to the believers in Rome is found in verse 1. He says, "What shall we say then? Are we to continue to sin so that grace may increase?" What does he mean by that? Well, in chapter 5, he makes the point that the law reveals sin. And because we know the law, we have the law, we know what sin is. And in a sense, you could argue that knowing the law then increased the amount of sin, but he concluded in chapter 5 by saying, but where sin did abound, grace did much more abound. That's the old King James translation that I memorized years ago, that grace exceeds sin. And so some people say, well, if that's true, let's sin more, because that means God can show more grace. Now, that's a silly argument, but it's one that some people made. God's grace does not give us an excuse, justification for sinning. Another excuse that they made was in verse 15. So look at verse 15. He says, what then? Shall we sin because we are not under the law but under grace? May it never be. Because in Jesus we are freed from the law, so we're no longer under the law, we're now under grace. Well, does that mean, hey, we can sin because we can always confess and get forgiveness? We're not under the law. We don't have to worry about that anymore. We'll just sin and God's grace will forgive us. And he says, no, that's not how it works. Either grace does not give us an excuse to sin. Now, an excuse that people sometimes make today is very similar to that one. It's the idea that well, because I'm saved and I'm saved forever, once saved, always saved, and God will forgive me, I don't have to be serious about holiness. I know I shouldn't do that, but God's going to forgive me. And some legalists, people who are very legalistic in their Christianity, will use that to attack Christians who are not legalistic. Well, you just believe in God's grace, so you think you can go and do whatever you want. No, Paul says that's nonsense. That's not, listen. That is not how saved people think. Paul tells us in this chapter in verse 5. Look at verse 5. He says, we have become united with him in the likeness of his death. Certainly, we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection. He says there's a spiritual union between a believer and Jesus. When you were saved, when you became a disciple of Jesus, there was a union between you and Jesus. And people who are united with Jesus don't think the way these excuses, say them. We just don't. I mean, if you're united with Jesus, think about this. You have a spiritual union with Jesus. Can you imagine Jesus saying, well, I can go ahead and sin because of grace. I can go ahead and sin because I'm not under the law. I don't have to worry about obeying the law. You see, true Christians don't think like that. What is our attitude as disciples, as followers of Jesus, as people who've really been saved? Well, look at verse 11. Verse 11, he says, even so, consider, think, have the attitude, consider yourselves to be dead to sin, but alive to God. Because I'm under the grace of God, I'm excited about that, and I'm alive to Jesus. I'm dead. I don't sit here. A disciple, a saved person doesn't sit and think, well, what can I get away with? A disciple thinks about, how can I live for Jesus? Her attitude in verses 12 and 13, he says, therefore do not let sin reign in your mortal body so that you obey its lust, and do not go on presenting the members of your body to sin as instruments of unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as those alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness to God. In other words, because you have been saved and set free from sin and set free from the law, you're so excited about the grace of God, you're just constantly focused on giving yourself and all the aspects of your life and your body to God. You're not trying to think, what can I get away with? And part of this also says, I don't put myself in environments where I'm going to be tempted to be unholy and ungodly because I don't want that. I'm going to put myself in environments that encourage my holiness. And so it's like an alcoholic, a recovering alcoholic, chooses not to go to a bar because he doesn't want to be faced with a temptation. He hangs out where he is encouraged in sobriety. Because we're under the grace of God, we want to put ourselves in an environment where our growth in Jesus and his grace, it just pushes us toward more holiness and godliness. And if you want to always put yourself in an environment that's different than that, where you're tempted to sin, man, you need to look in the mirror. Because something's wrong. Something is wrong. Legalism doesn't work. But if you're not driven to put yourself closer to Jesus, you need to be asking yourself why, and asking yourself, am I really, really saved? We're going to continue this thought tomorrow as we look at chapter 7.